Good evening, everybody, and welcome along. It is the evening of the 2nd of April, 2024. So a day beyond a joke, shall we say. And we now come to you today with a slight change in our scheduled programming because we didn't get to this particular agenda item yesterday. So we're going to be talking about it today. And that is, of course, the political demise, or at least the apparent political demise, of a certain Jeffrey Donaldson. And if you're unfamiliar with who Jeffrey Donaldson is, I will be explaining who he is and what he represented or represents in the coming program. And the scandal in which he has been enmeshed, shall we say, is rather vague, at least in the official press at this stage. However, it does afford us the opportunity to talk about a much bigger issue, which is, of course, the ongoing occupation of the 6 counties. When we referred to the occupied 6 counties, if you're not familiar with what this means, the actual old historic borders of Ulster, it would take in 9 counties of the 32 counties of Ireland. The occupied 6 counties were specifically chosen in the early 1920s as part of the partition deal that the British imposed upon Ireland with the able assistance of the Irish bourgeoisie and the Irish landlords to divide the country. And the occupied 6 counties of Ulster are, of course, what were at the time the majority Protestant areas that were regarded by the British as most likely to be, more able to be controlled by them. And of course, these 6 counties are Antrim, Armagh, Down, Fermanagh, Tyrone, and what's called County Londonderry. And this was described as a Protestant land for a Protestant people, and was ruled over by a system which will be familiar to you if you've studied the British Empire in any depths. It is a system of religious sectarianism, which is calculated to divide the working class on the most vicious lines that can be possibly devised. And of course, this was, all seen through by such great men as James Connolly, who wrote a great deal and carried out a great many actions against this sectarianism. And the purpose of it was to ensure a permanent British military occupation of at least one portion of Ireland, to keep a gun to the head, quite literally, of the newly established, what was at the time called the Irish Free State. It's still referred to as the Free State by some Irish Republicans, and also to ensure that that government that was established in Dublin after the formal independence of the Irish Free State never was going to be able to seriously threaten British interests, and would keep Ireland, the newly independent Ireland, in a subservient and neo-colonial status when it came to relations with the British Empire. Now, as time has gone on, British imperialism has decayed and its influence has somewhat faded. And of course, there will be those who say, well, why are you talking about this at all? Surely the great Tony Blair and Bill Clinton solved all of this with the Good Friday Agreement 26 years ago in 1998. Of course, that isn't true. Well, now, what was signed in 1998 was, of course, the Good Friday Agreement, which formalized a power-sharing assembly in Belfast, Stormont, where, of course, the old sectarian Protestant-dominated, or I should say, loyalist and landlord and capitalist dominated Parliament sat up to when it was suspended following the eruption of the civil rights movement and the repression of it in the late 1960s. And the re-establishment of Stormont in the 1990s has, well, it was an attempt by the British government to draw a line under it, or draw a line under the conflict, by recruiting the nationalist parties into essentially collaborating with the ongoing British occupation of the north of Ireland. Now, there will be those, including, of course, the current leadership of Sinn Féin, who would argue that because they've now got the majority in the Parliament of the North, the Northern Irish Assembly, and are soon, they hope, to gain a majority in the Parliament of the South, the Dáil Éireann, that they will then have a majority in both Irish parliaments, and therefore a poll on formal reunification of Ireland can surely not be too far away. Perhaps they are right. Perhaps they will be able to unify Ireland on this basis. I'm not going to say it's an impossible ask. Perhaps the calculation made by Adams and McGuinness many years ago, a calculation acted further upon by the current leadership of MacDonald and O'Neill, will prove to be correct. I have my doubts. And I have my doubts because what we're talking about here is trying to unify Ireland on the basis of degenerated Irish capitalism. And of course, Sinn Féin have dropped their previous opposition to the European Union, a institution which I think it's fair to say isn't exactly friendly to the rights of small nations. Just look at the fate of Greece, and of course the fate of the Republic of Ireland itself, following the 8 and 9. But also, the Sinn Féin program has been noticeably softening towards NATO in recent years, to the point where, of course, they were joining in so-called solidarity demonstrations with Ukraine, which is, of course, not a pro-Ukrainian position. It is a pro-US imperialist position, because it is US imperialism which plays, if not the dominant role, then a much bigger role in the affairs of Ireland now than it ever did in the past. British imperialism has still got its claws into Ireland, but they are joined in this by the US and, of course, by the German imperialists as well, who dominate the European Union. And Ireland is, of course, by the plans of the Irish capitalist class, been reduced to an economy based on being a tax haven, being used for multinational corporations to stash their money in, has been in the past based on rampant real estate speculation. Do we really think that the Irish capitalist class are capable of establishing a truly independent and sovereign Republic of Ireland? I do not think that. I think that James Connolly's old line is still correct, which is, even if Michelle O'Neill and the others in Sinn Féin manage to enact their plan of a border poll and reuniting the two parts of Ireland, to do so on a capitalist basis will mean that the imperialist powers will still rule Ireland. But it won't just be Britain this time. It'll be the US imperialists and the Germans along with them. And that's barely an improvement, truth be told. You rid yourselves of the British, and then you end up being forced as part of the deal to remove the British from Ireland, or you replace them with the Americans and end up being forced to join NATO. None of these things are exactly a path towards a genuine and sovereign and independent republic, to my mind. But this is by way of preamble, shall we say. We will now do our customary walk through those who are in the chat thus far. So we have Gracie Knoll, who's joining us from Seattle, Washington. Dr. Ahmed, who joins us from Egypt. Yepex, who's just stopping by as they are off to the gym. We have Martin joining us from a wisteria-veiled middle Georgia. Very poetic imagery there. We have Muzzle Paint, who joins us and says, "Solidarity, comrades." We have Battle Cossack, who's sitting in a room being bitten by mosquitoes with dengue fever. The government is not doing anything. That sounds a very unappealing situation. Fortunately, my blood's always been rather unappealing to mosquitoes, but they're literal pains wherever you meet them. Are you saying that the mosquitoes have got dengue fever, or you yourself have it? Because that's a very unpleasant condition. I knew people who contracted that in Southeast Asia. If that is the case, I hope you get over it soon. Battle Cossack adds, if socialism fails, Why capitalist countries spend so much money to destroy them? Why can't they let them collapse on their own? Well, the answer to that is in the question. The reason why they spent so much to destroy the Soviet Union and other countries is precisely because of socialism's successes, not its failures. The reason why they have to lie about everything is because planned economies do work. The reason why they have to demonize North Korea, or the DPRK, as I should give it its proper title, is precisely because its planned economy has kept it not only alive, but relatively successful for a country which is completely isolated. And they know that socialism does work and has worked and will work, and that is why they must destroy it anytime it emerges. Thomas, hello to you. CJ, greetings to you out in Richmond, Virginia. And CJ says, Chicago Workers' School comrades are starting to hold public events. Good developments. Indeed, it is. Very good. Be sure to check out the Chicago Workers' School if you are in the United States, especially if you are in the Chicago area, and get along to one of their events. And we've also got with us Otis, who says, good evening. Lisa's finally found the live stream again. I wasn't aware that it had gone missing. Perhaps we are being shadow banned. Battle Cossack doesn't have dengue fever. That's good. Nejat Mere says, hello from Istanbul. Good to have you with us. Okay, so we are here tonight, as I said, to talk about the strange case of a certain Jeffrey Donaldson, or Sir Jeffrey. I should give him his proper title, because he's probably earned it through services rendered to British imperialism. So I'm going to just share with you the article in which I'm talking about here. And it's a very basic article. It comes from Sky News. Now, Jeffrey Donaldson, if you don't know who he is, this is your man here in the picture. He's been an MP, a member of the British Parliament for Lagan Valley from 1997 to present day. So he's been around a long time in the political world. And Jeffrey Donaldson came up through the ranks of in the usual style for a man who grew up in the occupied six counties on the loyalist side of things, i.e. loyalist meaning loyal to the British crown, servants of British imperialism, foot soldiers for British imperialism. Grew up in the traditional style, and he joined the Young Unionists, which is basically a nightmarish loyalist version of the Boy Scouts. Was apparently a member of the old British paramilitary outfit, the Ulster Defence Regiment. He was, for a long time, a member of the old traditional Union Loyalist Party in Northern Ireland, which was, of course, the Ulster Unionist Party, which ran the province at the occupied six counties when it had its own Protestant parliament for a Protestant people back before what's euphemistically referred to as the Troubles began. He was a member of their political grouping, their parliamentary group, for quite a while. He was the youngest member of that group. I remember him being pretty big news in the negotiations over the deal to reestablish the Stormont Parliament back in the day, because he represented like the most reactionary wing, even more reactionary wing of the Ulster Unionist Party. Of course, he left the Ulster Unionist Party slightly later on and joined the party of the late and unlamented Reverend Ian Paisley. Now, if you're not familiar with the Reverend Ian Paisley, he is now deceased, maniacal, ultra-reactionary Protestant clergyman, the leader of what I would call the lumpenized resistance to the Republican and Catholic-run civil rights movement. Though I should always stress, for those who aren't perhaps familiar with the politics of this, that the way in which the conflict in Ireland from the 60s to the 90s is always portrayed in the British bourgeois press is always Catholic versus Protestant, but that was never the real story that was going on. There were plenty of people from traditionally Protestant families who joined the cause of republicanism, many who became socialist Republicans as well. So it's never just broken down on sectarian lines. the British government always tried to promote it as a sectarian conflict in the same manner that they tried to do in, for instance, India. The British government, the British imperialists, wherever they go, be it close to home in Ireland or further afield, India or South Africa, wherever they go, they always use the same method to control things, which is find a minority religious or ethnic grouping, place them in positions of authority and power above the majority grouping, give them special privileges, and have them run things for you so that they're your bullet stoppers when the populace revolts. Then when there is a revolt, declare it to be a religious war, a sectarian war, a war between ethnic groups, a war between two groups of horrendous barbarians who just can't live together. And we, the poor put upon British, have to come in and keep these animals apart, and if we don't do it, they'll just tear each other to pieces. Is this starting to sound familiar? Because this is the same argument the US imperialists use. This, of course, was the same perverted logic which led the British imperialists to aid in the foundation of the colonial enterprise known as Israel. Remember the words of the British colonial official in occupied Palestine after World War I, Sir Ronald Stores, who said, and we've repeated this many times because it's a quote that reveals so much, that they were out to create with Israel a, quote, little loyal Jewish Ulster in a sea of hostile Arabism, meaning that you set up the Zionist colonial entity and it helps you in terms of, i.e. the British imperialists, keep the rest of the Arab world divided and weak. And that is why, of course, it had to be established, and why the US imperialists have maintained it and continue to maintain it ever since. So the Ulster model, the Irish model of occupation and division and deliberate fostering of sectarianism, is very much one that the British imperialists are an absolute specialist in delivering all over the world. So always resist the British imperialist framing of this. That it was just Catholic versus Protestant. And I remember, because I grew up in the 80s and the 90s when a lot of the most spectacular actions were taking place in the conflict in the north of Ireland. And the way in which, because I can remember this quite clearly, the way in which the Irish as a whole, not just the Southern Irish, but also the so-called loyalists in the north, were portrayed in the British press was largely as animals, as people who were less than human. Not just the Irish Republicans either, though. Irish republicanism always triggers the British ruling class in a major way. Like if you want to get like a bourgeois British guy of a certain age really angry, start talking to him about your support for the IRA or something. That'll really push them over the edge. But the point is that even the loyalists in the north were described in like searingly racist terms by many people in the press. They were all Irishmen were portrayed as like these sort of barely literate heathens, these like wild men who couldn't possibly run a country, couldn't possibly live together, and that the Northern Irish, the Ulster loyalists, were barely any better than the Republican Irish. That's how the British ruling class actually viewed their dedicated servants in the north. They didn't view them with much more favor than they did the Southern Irish or the Northern Irish Republicans. They regarded them as crude. They regarded them as simple. They regarded them as easily manipulated, violent, desperate men who could be pushed around the chessboard by the intelligence agencies. And that's how they viewed them. So this is the background to this story. So Donaldson rose to become the leader of the DUP following the death of Ian Paisley, and then the cycling through like a couple of leaders who were regarded as too strange and too politically inadequate to lead the party, such as Edwin Poots. And he, of course, came to lead the party in Westminster. Then there was another scandal in the North of Ireland when the former First Minister, or colleague of his called Arlene Foster, was immersed in a corruption scandal over the so-called Cash for Ash affair. Now, Donaldson, as it says here in the Sky News article, strenuously contests the allegations, the historic sexual assault allegations or should we say allegations of historical sexual offenses that have been made against him. But he has stepped down as party leader, and he has been suspended by the Democratic Unionist Party. Also, an unnamed 57-year-old woman has also been charged with aiding and abetting offenses in relation to the same complaint. And that is all the detail that all of these articles are prepared to share. If you check, I'll stop the screen share there. If you check like the most of the bourgeois press in Britain, you will find only the same thing, that Jeffrey Donaldson has resigned his position following allegations of historic sex offenses. It doesn't say what these are. There are a lot of rumors, which I'm not going to repeat here because this is a public broadcast. All I will say is that Mr. Donaldson has, of course, denied any wrongdoing and vows that he will contest the case. Now, what does this tell us, though, about the role of Jeffrey Donaldson, and more to the point, his historical associations with loyalism in the occupied 6 counties of Ireland? Now, Jeffrey Donaldson is of the younger end of the loyalist leadership, but he, of course, came up during a time and was a member of the Ulster Unionist Party at a time when many in it were linked to some incredibly dubious characters, to say the least, and some downright criminal, murderous, and characters who can only be described as paedophile rapists, who were prominent in the leadership of the official Ulster Unionist Party and also the loyalist paramilitary organizations that were running around the north of Ireland at the time, often, and then we'll come to demonstrate how this happened, with the connivance and active collaboration of the British intelligence services. So Jeffrey Donaldson, who I'm associated with, the leader of the Ulster Unionist Party between 1979 and 1995, a guy called James Molyneux. James Molyneux was reported, and I think this is pretty much confirmed, to have been a man who, shall we say, preferred not just the company of men, that would be one thing, but the company of significantly younger men. He was a Jeffrey Epstein type figure, shall we say, who, rather than teenage girls, preferred teenage boys. And again, that's pretty well established by this stage. He, i.e. Molyneux, had some very dubious associations with characters who were, if not active assets of British intelligence, then certainly were protected by British intelligence. One of these characters is the notorious paedophile, rapist, and wannabe Protestant leader of a united Protestant Ireland, a certain William McGrath. Now, William McGrath was a ultra right-wing reactionary Protestant lunatic who was running around Belfast in the 1950s and 1960s as he became a very prominent member of the Orange Order. He was putting forward a form of Protestant radicalism, which even other members of the Orange Order found a bit bizarre. Much of the information that I'm about to go through here is taken from a few sources, which I have listed on the newly established Telegram group that lists the sources I use for each episode. But the opening part of the information here I'm going to share is from a book by the late, and it must be said, great investigative journalist, Paul Foote. Now, Paul Foote was a long-time writer for the British Daily Mirror. He was an investigative journalist who did a lot of very interesting work for the British bourgeois liberal publication Private Eye. But he wrote a book in the late 1980s called Who Framed Colin Wallace? And this is where the information about William McGrath comes from. Now, but before we get to that, we should just establish who Colin Wallace is. Wallace was a British Army PSYOPs man who worked in the occupied 6 counties in the early parts of the period referred to as the Troubles. He was a guy responsible for press and media management and also running the kind of strange psychological operations and information manipulation and management that have become the hallmark, really, of British intelligence operations right up to this day. And Wallace was apparently very good at his job. However, he was one of those strange individuals who, as Paul Foote notes in his introduction, does actually believe in the things that he actually serves. So Colin Wallace was a sincere believer in the crown, the church, and the British state. The British state, which would later, for reasons I'll go into in another program, went on to betray him, and he ended up doing time in prison. But Colin Wallace was involved in a number of the most dubious operations of the British state in the early 1970s and before, including he was able to provide information to Foote on the activities of the British state in Northern Ireland, and of course various other activities involving Army intelligence, MI5 and MI6 in the early 1970s, including plots against Harold Wilson, the Labour Party Prime Minister, and more. So it's a fascinating book, Who Framed Colin Wallace, but he chronicles the activities of this bizarre character, William McGrath, in that. Now, I will read the introduction to chapter 3 of this book. I'll read the opening page because it gives you an overview of who this character McGrath and how he fits in to this scandal and how he can be linked to various individuals with whom Jeffrey Donaldson has a strong association himself, including James Molyneux, former leader of the UUP, Donaldson's original party, and the Reverend Ian Paisley, the founder and longtime leader of Donaldson's current party, the DUP. So I will now quote from the words of Paul Foote in introducing this. Divided and warped societies like Northern Ireland breed more than their fair share of divided and warped personalities. A peculiar example of that is William McGrath, the central character in the Kincora Boys' Home scandal. McGrath was a typical product of the fanaticism which has sustained the Protestant supremacy in the north of Ireland ever since it was planted there in the 16th century. He had little to no natural ability, save a certain slick gift of the gab and a pedantic acquaintance with obscure religious texts. In the 1950s and early 1960s, he was the full-time secretary of the Christian Fellowship Centre and Emancipation Crusade, which was based at Faith House, Finnehy, South Belfast. There he would preside over meetings of young men whom he recruited by speaking at Orange lodges and missions throughout Northern Ireland. The young men were attracted by the extremism of his views, especially by the mystique and the secrecy with which McGrath built up his political organization. His followers made up for their small numbers by the extreme levels of dedication which McGrath always demanded of them, though never of himself. Politics in Northern Ireland in the 1950s were deceptively becalmed. The Protestant state for a Protestant people, which had been proclaimed in 1922, appeared to be working without too much fuss. The minority Catholic population, though they hated the state, did not express their hatred in violence. The IRA campaign of 1956 to 1961 was a disaster. The Protestant power complex, which was founded on the Orange lodges, was getting older and more complacent. Nothing, it seemed, could loosen their grip. William McGrath challenged this complacency. In his sermons, which were illustrated by slides of Roman Catholics carrying out weird and fanatical activities, he denounced the traditional notion that the Protestant case rested on a separate state in the north, which was bound to Britain. McGrath insisted that Protestant power must have an Irish dimension. He was not afraid or ashamed to describe himself as Irish. He argued that the British statelet was a distortion of Protestant theory. All Ireland, he insisted, should be Protestant and one day would be. He backed up his view with the theory that the lost tribes of Israel had come to settle in the British Isles, and that the chosen people, therefore, had been in Ireland long before the Catholics. The Protestants were not planted, he argued, but had been there all along, as part of a plan laid down by the Almighty. By the way, is this starting to sound familiar yet? To the meetings of young men in his home in the 1950s and 60s, McGrath would introduce members of the British Israelite Society from England and Scotland, people with views even more bizarre than his own. The difference was that while the British Israelites held their views in the privacy of their own homes without upsetting or bothering anyone else, McGrath's ideas, among introspective superstitions of Northern Ireland politics, struck a chord. So that's who William McGrath was. And William McGrath was also a man who was called, as footnotes in his introduction there, was a guy who liked to gather, shall we say, large numbers of teenage boys around him for reasons that will become obvious as we go on. McGrath was also the lead suspect in and was ultimately convicted in 1981 of the what I would only describe as a sickening series of rapes that were carried out at a place called the Kincora Boys Home, where he worked for several years in the early to middle 1970s. Now, McGrath, his proclivities were well known to many in the Ulster Unionist fraternity. And he was well known to have a predilection for teenage boys. He was well known to be a rapist of children. And this was reported to the authorities in the Protestant statelet in the 1960s by those who knew him. The activities of not just McGrath, but the other managers who were also paedophiles of the Kincora Boys Home were complained about by boys who were sent there over many years. McGrath, who was even more violent and even more brutal than the previous management there, was complained about to the RUC. That was the sectarian police force that the British used to keep control there. And even a Protestant missionary, a woman, actually raised this with Ian Paisley, because McGrath was a very senior member of the Orange Order in Northern Ireland in the late 60s and early 1970s. He was associated closely with Ian Paisley for a while. He even ran his own paramilitary organization, given the traditional Irish name of Tara, which apparently used to be the place where the old Irish kings were crowned. McGrath's ideas, such as they were, on the lost tribes of Israel settling in Ireland, and therefore the great Protestant people had been there since before those dastardly Catholics showed up. Well, if that sounds familiar, it's one of the reasons why that, of course, Ulster loyalism is so closely associated with Zionism. Protestantism and Zionism tend to go rather hand in hand, it must be said, in many instances, particularly in the British case. Just to go on a digression for a while, there were various forms of Protestant Zionism have existed, particularly in the ruling class in Britain, going all the way back to the 17th century. Cromwell himself had some rather strange ideas about the Jews and their role. In fact, the reason why he lifted the centuries-long embargo on Jewish migration into England was because he believed that Jews had to be there for the rapture to occur. Now, of course, later Protestants reversed that and said the Jews all had to be removed to the Holy Land for the rapture to occur. But Protestantism and odd ideas about lost tribes of Israel and the place of the Jews in the world and the fate of the Holy Land, these all tend to get wrapped around each other, and the Protestants tend to produce these strange theories because these were often theories which were come up with, dreamed up by various ruling class politicians in Britain, including people like Lord Salisbury, particularly with reference to the settling of the Jews in Palestine. So that that fanatics like William McGrath would have these ideas about the north of Ireland and associate them with, being a lost tribe of Israel. This shouldn't exactly be a surprise. Imperial Protestantism has always produced these things. When you wrap Christianity around the imperialism and try to shape official British Anglicanism and various forms of British Protestantism, sort of free church Protestantism, to suit the needs of British imperialism, what you end up with is a rather dirty and horrible cocktail of strange supremacist ideas, which were unfortunately inflicted upon Ireland for many, many years. So McGrath's ideas, though they sound utterly batshit, were fairly common in the ruling circles of the Ulster statelet at the time. Now, it must also be said that from the beginning in the early 1920s, when the occupied 6 counties were first carved off from the rest of Ireland, it was dominated by the parliament, the sectarian parliament there, and the power structures there were dominated by the Ulster manufacturers and landowners. And these were the people who ran everything and set up the sectarian state to suit their purposes, keep the working class divided, set up not a Protestant land for Protestant people, but really a statelet for landlords and capitalists draped in an orange flag, to draw upon the words of James Connolly there. And this is the way they ran it for decades. And it was the Ulster bourgeois and landowners who were the ones who ultimately revolted against any attempt at compromise that might have come from the London government, though, of course, they were always encouraged in this by certain, or the more, shall we say, extreme elements within the British ruling class. Remember what we've said before about fascism and all its variants. Fascism and all its variants always have a root in a particular class, and that particular class is the bourgeoisie. They are the ones who fund it, who arm it, who give it its uniforms and tell it to parade around. And when fascism seems rather limp and useless and pathetic and filled with these bizarre individuals whom no one would look at twice, that is precisely because the ruling class have no interest in promoting it at that given moment in time. So it just becomes a hangout spot for incels, losers, and weirdos. And the issue, the way, by looking at the actions of a character like William McGrath and his friends, who we shall meet more of them as this story goes on, we can see that when crisis comes and the British bourgeoisie, or any bourgeoisie, feels the need to go on an offensive, then these freaks and criminals and perverts and degenerates like McGrath, like the man who went on to later found the Red Hand Commandos, John McKeague, who was had similar proclivities to McGrath. These characters, who would never rage in any other time, become leaders because they're promoted by the bourgeoisie. Now, McGrath, who by the early 1970s, according to reports written by Colin Wallace when he was in British Army intelligence, covered in the book by Paul Foote, was receiving complaints even from even within the Protestant religious organizations that McGrath was such a horrific, violent rapist of children who had been reported to the RUC many, many times. And even RUC detectives had investigated him and had sent reports up to the chief officers of the RUC. All of these reports had disappeared. Now, why is that? What the book by Foote, drawn from the reflections of Colin Wallace, makes clear is that McGrath had some association with MI5 or MI6 or both. And MI5 was interested in running characters like McGrath as assets within the Protestant movement. And of course, a character like McGrath, being fatally compromised, on the one hand, presenting the face of Protestant respectability. He was, of course, married and had a number of children. He, on the other hand, was well known to be a complete degenerated individual, a rapist, a pedophile who preyed upon teenage boys. And this was relatively easy for the authorities to find out. And so this is why Foote says in his book, and seems to be confirmed by the many reports that were made about McGrath that were ignored by the Ulster authorities, that he was being protected by somebody. And he was being protected because he was a useful asset for MI5 to have. Now, in the end, the scandal became too big because McGrath was too much of a degenerate criminal to be discreet in his activities. He was being too public and too obvious, and his crimes had gone on for far too long to hide anymore. So eventually, he was convicted of some of his crimes in 1981. But he had been abusing boys at Kincora and in other places in Northern Ireland for decades. And the security services in this country knew all about it. They knew what he was up to. They knew what John McKeague, the founder of the Red Hand Commando, was up to. And McKeague was a brutal sectarian murderer. And they were just fine with it because these guys are absolutely ideal for recruitment by the British state because they're fatally compromised. They have secrets which, if revealed, would have them killed, even by many on their own side. And of course, by being a guy like McGrath, by being such a prominent member of the Orange Order and associating himself with Ian Paisley, with others like James Molyneux, with his known proclivities, he becomes a character who can take others down with him by association. And so not only have you got dirt on McGrath that you can get used to manipulate him, but his presence in these circles enables you then to hold that over the heads of others. So it has long been argued by Irish Republicans that there wasn't a single thing that went on inside the Loyalist movement in Northern Ireland with the likes of Paisley and others, which wasn't directly or indirectly under the control of British intelligence. And there were, of course, turf wars between the ultra-ruthless, sadistic reactionaries in MI5 and Army Intel and the British civilian police, some of which came out later in the John Stalker affair. But what has been incontestably established by this stage is that people like McGrath, people like McKeague were assets of British intelligence, that they were allowed to carry on raping teenage boys at like Kincora and other places in Northern Ireland throughout the 1970s, that they were protected by the RUC commanders and by British intelligence in order to maintain them as assets. And this is standard operating procedure for the British intelligence services. Find people who are fatally compromised and use them to do your dirty work for you. And when you turn to people like McKeague, who was, again, a horrific sectarian murderer, he was doing the dirty work of the British ruling class by engaging in sectarian murders, as were people like the Shankill Butchers, who emerged later on in the early 1980s, as chronicled in the book Loyalists by the BBC reporter Peter Taylor, which, again, a book of bourgeois history, but a book with a lot of interesting historical details in it. The way that the Loyalist terror gangs always operated in the occupied 6 counties was, it becomes very familiar if you look at other places where the boot print of British colonialism is. Their terror campaigns were focused on fomenting sectarian war to try and turn the Irish Republican campaigns of national liberation into a sectarian war. And they did that by brutal killings of, well, just any working class Catholic or nationalist that they could find. You had the Shankill Butchers, which was essentially an organization of serial killers. Later on, you had people like Billy Wright, who was a leader of I think it was the Loyalist Volunteer Force, who was, again, nothing more than just a psychopathic scumbag dressed up in a Union Jack. And these were the people that the British state employed to do their dirty work for them. Because the whole aim was, in my view, that they were scared by, the British state was frightened by the emergence of the civil rights movement. They were frightened by the strength which Irish republicanism had within the working class communities, or the Republican communities of the north of Ireland within the occupied 6 counties. And they were trying to use any method they could to derail that and uproot it. And so the systematic application of terror via not only the forces of the state, but by the Loyalist paramilitary organizations, that was a key tool in the British state's campaign to try and uproot support for Irish republicanism within the Irish working class in the north. And that tactic was one that they pursued for many, many years. And so, of course, when they decided that they reached a point where they could do a deal with the Sinn Féin leadership, of course, they didn't necessarily pull the plug on the Ulster Loyalists, but they made it pretty clear to them that they couldn't continue any longer. that the British state had reached a deal which was a pretty good accommodation from the point of view of the British ruling class, and therefore that their services were no longer really required. So a lot of these characters immediately turned to drug dealing and gangsterism and all kinds of other dubious activities. Another interesting comparison between the loyalists and the nationalists and the Republicans was the reading material. I'll conclude on this anecdote that they had with them in the places like the Maze prison. It was reported, and this was an anecdote told to me by an Irish comrade many years ago, that in the Republican prisoners' wing, they all had, some of them had the Bible and theological books. A lot of them had works by Lenin, by Marx, by Mao, and that was like the reading material in the Republican wing. In the Loyalist wing, it was all bodybuilding magazines and porno mags. I think that by that you can draw a lot of conclusions. But the Donaldson story gave me the opportunity to talk about this, and Donaldson certainly is directly linked to the characters that I've been talking about here. He's directly linked to James Molyneux, who was a longtime associate of William McGrath. He's directly linked to Ian Paisley, who was also an associate of William McGrath. Paisley himself wasn't implicated in the Kincora scandal as a participant in these horrible crimes, but he knew what was going on, and he didn't take any action about it. He covered up for McGrath. Because, again, I think Paisley knew very well who McGrath's protectors were, and he knew, Paisley did, not to bite too much at the hand that fed him. The British state always pretended to have an adversarial relationship with Paisley, but I think Paisley was doing the dirty work of the most reactionary sections within the British ruling class and the British state, and was doing so for much of his career. And so these are the people that the British state employs to do its dirty work: child rapists, sex offenders, mass murderers, serial killers, drug dealers. You wonder where the US imperialists got all their tricks from? Well, they got them from the British imperialists. That's who imparted all the lessons. Everything that the CIA does today, MI6 pioneered yesterday. And that is where I'll leave my remarks on that for this evening, and we'll catch up with some comments. Right. Where are we now? Okay. GCCX Pro says, I remember back to mid-80s news hearing all about the IRA in Ireland. Yeah, it's kind of gone off the front pages, but of course the British occupation remains. There's still quite a lot of British military personnel in Northern Ireland. That's an army of occupation. So the army of occupation remains. It's just that they brought in, first of all, John Hume and his gang to partner up with the Ulster Unionists to run Stormont for them. And now it's the DUP and Sinn Féin. So they bring in the nationalist forces to basically run the occupation for them. Wayne Table says, when people say Khrushchev brought capitalism to the Soviet Union, what specific policy are they referring to? And how did Khrushchev's economic policies differ from the policies of Lenin and Stalin? Well, Wayne, I'll have to give you a brief answer because, as you say, it is off topic. Khrushchev started the process of privatization of the state property by, rather than the state running and owning the things like the tractor stations at the that were serviced, that were provided to the collective farms, he started privatizing the state property by allowing the collective farms to take over the tractor stations. That was one example of like letting the growth in capitalist relations come back in. Other examples would be, for instance, the introduction of market mechanisms and bonus schemes into the management structure of the state industries. But the biggest one was the demotion of the role of the working class in the planning process and the running of the state, and the promotion of various different elements of private capitalist management systems into the way in which the Soviet industry was run. Kieran and Kenny, in their book Socialism Betrayed, give a very good rundown of this. Now, Khrushchev's defenders will always say, oh, yes, but Lenin and Stalin learnt from the capitalists in various different ways. So why are you being mean to Khrushchev? But the point I would make is that the biggest crime of Khrushchev, more than anything else, is his dismantling of the worker input into the planned economy and his strengthening of the role of the bureaucracy and his demotion and demolition of the dictatorship of the proletariat and promotion of bureaucratic rule and social democratic methods. Now, Wayne, if you want me to do a more full answer on that, I am happy to do so because I could talk for about an hour on it. But that was my brief answer. You can find more details in the Kieran and Kenny book, Socialism Portrayed, and their chapter on that gives a good overview of the answer that you're looking for there. Jeremy says, didn't Bill Gates have a plan afoot to vaccinate mosquitoes, or has that transpired and thus the explosion of dengue mosquitoes in South America? I don't know. I mean, I'm not up to speed on that, but a lot of what Bill Gates says about like vaccines is just reflecting whatever business interest that he's got at the time. Todd says, thank you for covering this subject. Well, it's a disgusting subject, but it needs to be talked about. Battle Cossack says, today we are commemorating our veterans who fought against the British to take back our islands. Well, you may yet get them back when the British Empire finally implodes. GCCX Pro says, all this crap with British Israelism begins with the notion of Christian Kabbalah, back to the flood, John Dee of the Elizabethan era. That's interesting. Yeah. Bizarre, like Israelite stuff has been around for quite some time. Protestantism has got a lot to answer for, as it turns out. Catholicism has too. Let's not draw any lines here. But British ruling class Protestantism has come up with some truly bizarre ideas, mainly designed to justify acts of imperialism. Martin says, Scots-Irish immigrants in the US came up with its own version of Ulster Zionism in the USA, i.e. Mormonism. Yes, exactly. I've never been to Utah, but I'm told it's terrible. GCCX Pro says, all these stories make clear why Nazism and Zionism are so close. Yeah, because they come from the same place. They're both the bastard British imperialism being like one of the chief suspects in the creation of both. Dingo and Baby has joined us. Mr. Chopin has joined us from Kansas. Errol Kim says, can anyone tell me what the beef with Brighton is exactly? The beef is that I had to go there for many years for union conferences, and I hated every minute of it. I am mainly joking about it, I must say. Mainly it's something I say to wind up Southerners. But I can't stand the place. Overpriced, absolute fucking shithole. There's a lot of shitholes in Britain, by the way. I've lived in many of them. Nobody's fault who lives there. It's just the way that British capitalism is these days. Underinvestment, overpriced property, declining transport infrastructure, no job opportunities that are worth a shit. That's British capitalism. Reduces many places that should be nice. Brighton should be nice. It's on the coast, but it's an overpriced shithole. Many places like that. That's just the way that the degeneracy is going these days. Jenny has joined us. Jeremy Turner says, I would love to hear her talk about Khrushchev. Well, you may get your wish very soon. Morgan says, with recent events in Palestine, there are more young people speaking favorably of the IRA. Well, I'm not surprised. The Irish national question will not fully be solved without the removal of imperialism from Ireland. The Irish ruling class, as I said in the opening, are not capable of delivering that. I don't think they will ever be capable of delivering that. They were always a weak and truncated creation. When I was in Dublin recently, Irish comrades told me a very interesting fact that there were even some Irish capitalists in what is now the Republic who were actually opposed to the Republic being founded and wanted their own carve out for their own statelet. So, like, the Irish ruling class have never really been committed to the cause of Irish independence and sovereignty. It was something that was forced on them by the Irish masses, ultimately, by Irish revolutionaries of the Republican and the socialist variety. So this is the reality here, which is that Ireland will, even if the Sinn Féin leaders are right and that they can get their border poll through, and they get the vote on like getting rid of the British from the north and reunification. The reason why O'Neill has been going over to Washington D.C. to kiss the feet of Genocide Joe, reason why her and MacDonald have been going and debasing themselves, is because they think they can get U.S. imperialism on side for this. Now, U.S. imperialism may well come on side because, God knows they're not going to do the British any favors. But of course, they will insist that their interests be looked after, which means Ireland being in NATO, which is why the Sinn Féin leaders are dropping any opposition they had to it. And they are, of course, having to make a stand over the Palestine issue because of popular feeling. I think that there would be a revolt in the ranks of their own party if they didn't. But don't be surprised if they're even prepared to jettison that in the end. If the prize as they see it is Genocide Joe or Donald Trump coming on board with jettisoning the British from Ireland, then they will see it as a price worth paying. But of course, Ireland united on a capitalist basis inside the EU, inside NATO, well, what independence is that? And again, like, it is my view that only Irish Republican socialism renewed for this generation is going to be able to win this struggle once and for all. And that is something that I believe ever more as time goes on. And ultimately, I don't think that the ultra-reactionaries in the British state, whose position I think is strengthening as the crisis worsens, I don't think those ultra-reactionaries are going to agree to this anytime soon either. Now, as to why they've allowed Jeffrey Donaldson to be disposed of, that's another interesting question, because and again, I must emphasize, Mr. Donaldson, Sir Jeffrey, I'm sure he earned the knighthood, has denied any wrongdoing. But if this is a historic allegation, and we don't know from how long ago this comes, and this is something that would be known to the British security services, I'm going to bet, again, I'm speculating, that whatever this allegation is, it is known to the British security services. Somebody as prominent as Donaldson, who has been a very high-ranking MP for the Loyalists in the occupied 6 counties for over a quarter of a century, when it comes to such a security-sensitive position as leader of the main Loyalist party in Northern Ireland, the British security services will have gone through his record with a fine-tooth comb. They will know everything about him. They will know every bit of dirt he's ever done. So they will have known about this. So the question is, well, why has it come out now? Were there internet rumors? Was it just a scandal they couldn't hold back anymore? Or have they just decided, is it a combination of things? Is it a combination of the fact that there were too many rumors about him online, that an investigation had to be held, and also that he'd outlived any usefulness and they've got a tame successor that they can bring in anyway? Or are they looking to revive, or are some of the reactionaries perhaps looking to revive loyalism, given that we're heading into a greater crisis now, given that loyalism has a lot of extensive links to British fascism? Other point I should emphasize is that, again, go back and look at who the leaderships of the various British fascist organizations have been. Look at the leadership of the EDL. Their criminal records were leaked online by some hackers a decade ago. What does it show? Biggest set of convictions are for criminal convictions, that is, sex offenses, rapists, pedophiles, woman beaters, all kinds of disgusting characters in that fascist group's leadership. And again, that's no accident. But on the one hand, it's groups that emphasize racial domination, dictatorship, the inferior nature of women, all of which is part of fascism, all of which is part of Ulster loyalism and the extreme forms of like wildly reactionary Protestantism that they engage in. All of that attracts a certain sort of character. Generally, those who, like William McGrath, ultra reactionaries who insist on probity and proper Protestant values, and every home being a gleaming temple to God on the one hand, and then on the other, they're the most degenerate, low-life perverts imaginable. And again, like, you don't need to be Sigmund Freud or Jacques Lacan to work out what is going on there. And this is just who these supremacist, ultra-reactionary forms of politics attract. Always been the case. You have a conversation with more than 5 minutes with a fascist, and unfortunately I've had to have one on more than one occasion. Not only are these people some of the most degenerated and stupid individuals you'll ever find in your life, but they're also, you don't have to talk to them too long to find that one of the most central things that they keep coming back to, if they talk to you for more than a few minutes, is the extreme hatred of women. It's one of the things that you find out about them very, very quickly. Like, for all that banging on about family values and all that, what that generally means is that the man gets to abuse his property, i.e. his wife and the female members of his household. And, well, who would that attract exactly, other than the worst individuals that you can possibly imagine? Right. Okay, we will now go through the further comments here. HSD says, greetings from sunny Australia, where the world's first Labour government was elected. It was a minority government in Queensland and retained power for an entire week before being ousted. Interesting historical detail there. Thank you. Daryl Davis says, good on you for speaking to that MI6. America is an outgrowth, not a root. Well, yeah, it's everything the British Empire started, the American imperialism picked up and made bigger. I'll say that. Errol Kim says, I live in West London, but I'm Irish working class. Thanks for the explainer. Yeah. One of the things you need to learn about anybody from the north of England, I'm from the northwest of England, is that we generally spend a lot of our time mocking and belittling anybody who's from south of Birmingham. Even though, of course, in typical style, half my family's from south of Birmingham. The other thing you need to know about the north of England, the northwest of England in particular, is that basically, for a lot of us, we're directly descended from Irish ancestry anyway. Like, you go around Manchester back in the day when the time known as the Troubles was active, back from like the late 60s through to the mid 90s. There was a lot of support for Irish republicanism within the Liverpool and Manchester and wider northwest working class. Like, support for the continued occupation of Ireland is something that really was an obsession for the British ruling class, and certain elements in the petty bourgeoisie, like the officer corps of the British Army, extremely reactionary bunch, of course, the people who provide the personnel for the intelligence services, obviously, and the lumpens. The lumpens who provide the foot soldiers for the fascist organizations in Britain. They're the ones who are the most enthusiastic about it. The working class was unenthusiastic at best, and actively hostile a lot of the time to the continued British presence in the occupied 6 counties of Ireland. A lot of the working class who actually served there came out having a rather mixed bag of opinions, but a lot of them absolutely hated the RUC and hated the loyalist paramilitaries as well. So in the English Northwest, like, there was a lot of sympathy for Irish republicanism. There's Republican clubs in Manchester. There's a long history of Fenian activities here, going all the way back to the middle 19th century. So the British position on Ireland is, remember this, it's always what's presented as the British position is always a ruling class position, and a position held by the most reactionary parts of the British state, generally the officer corps of the military, the intelligence services, supported by fascist bands of lumpens in the streets who are, of course, funded by the bourgeois. Right. Where are we now? Daryl Davis says Battle Cossack is speaking to the explosion of malaria outgrowths in South America starting in the 2010s. I think Africa got a spell of it too. That's interesting. I wasn't aware of this, so it's something I'll have to look into. If there is an enthusiasm out there amongst you viewers and listeners for me to look further into this, I'm happy to do so. Errol Kim says the contemporary Irish ruling class are ruthlessly unimaginative scumbags who are late to the NGO party and want to make up for wasted opportunities. Yeah, I've been to Ireland, once a few weeks ago. The time before that was a decade ago. I intend to go there to get away and do some walking in the summer of this year. If you have any good walking recommendations in Ireland, do let me know. But each time I've been there, I'm reminded of the fact that this is a ruling class which is unfit to rule anything. So the British ruling class, by the way, but like the Irish ruling class, a particularly degenerate bunch of absolutely useless scumbags who are still completely beholden to imperialism and would have happily sold out the independence struggle back in the late 1900s and early 1920s if they could have possibly gotten away with it. Many in the Irish Republican movement argued that they did sell it out, and that's why you got partition. I mean, there's an interesting story to be told, an interesting piece of history to explore if we look at like the arguments that were presented by the pro-partition side, including the argument that the British would have invaded all over again, put up a naval blockade of the country and tried to starve Ireland out. There's an interesting case to explore there as to whether those arguments put forward by the pro-treaty side were ever legitimate or whether the British were bluffing. TD Mallard says, finally, a channel doing Marxist analysis of schizoid and spooky reactionaries. There's a lot of it. Well, the ruling class, and particularly true of the British ruling class, are a bizarre bunch. Like, they're not rational actors. You're brought up to regard these people as like masters of the universe, like people completely in charge of things. But let's go back to the material here. Start with the material root of things. They're at the head of a fundamentally irrational system. Their position within it is always insecure. They are horribly aware, the bourgeoisie are, that they are a tiny minority of the population facing an ever-growing mass of proletarians. And to justify that to themselves as much as anything else, you need all kinds of crazy beliefs to justify your position in that system. That you are personally put there by God is quite a popular choice. That you are on a mission from God. That the Almighty has chosen you to civilize the barbarians. If we're talking about imperialism, then Protestant missionary zeal plays a big role in Africa. The Protestant missionaries for it. In many ways, ideologically and practically disarming the African masses, trying to pacify them into acceptance of colonial rule with the promise of reward in the great hereafter. And of course, you get out of that system because, again, the ruling class is running this fundamentally irrational system which crashes and collapses every few years, and is like, to use Marx's term, like a sorcerer who was summoned up forces from the beyond that he cannot possibly control. Now, if you're a capitalist, if you are the sorcerer in this particular analogy, and you have conjured up forces in the form of a recession, in the form of a gathering recession, which you cannot control, and you are, of course, not a Marxist because you're an anti-communist, and therefore you have to explain why the economy goes up and down, why things crash violently and collapse, why things become unstable, why the working class revolts, why the colonized peoples won't accept your rule. And so you have to come up with all these bizarre and crazy theories, first of all, to explain it to yourself. And that's why you have, various cabinet ministers in Britain in the 19th century believing firmly that Britain is the center of God's plan and that we will create heaven on earth via occupying a quarter of the globe. Why the British are a lost tribe of Israel. You name it, they believe in it. And because it all goes back to justifying your place in the world, rationalizing the outcomes of a fundamentally irrational system, and your place at the top of it. And if you need to rationalize this fundamentally irrational system, then you're going to come up with fundamentally irrational sets of beliefs. And so that's why you get like crazy shit going on in British ruling class circles. That, and, the good old fashioned ruling class bonding rituals they engaged in Eton and Oxford and Cambridge, which of course are centuries old. See also the various different clubs like Skull and Bones in the United States. What about Margaret Thatcher? Well, what about Margaret Thatcher, Grassy Knoll? Errol Kim says there is now almost no working class left in London. Even the Spectator or Spike was running an article about it. Where in London are you referring to? I mean, you live there, not me. So, but I know comrades who do live there. So, I know that certain areas of London have pushed out the working class entirely. The aim of the ruling class is to certainly cleanse, if they possibly can on a class basis, large areas of London, and that the workforce that they need comes in from the outer rim of the city. But I haven't done myself, and perhaps I should, a serious investigation into the class composition of inner London now. Perhaps I'll add that to the list. I mean, yeah, Errol Kim's comment, which is a lot of it is now just ruling class functionaries are city boys. Yeah, that'll be the case. But there's still a lot of very working class areas of London. At least that's my knowledge of the situation. Correct me if I am wrong in that. HSD says, do you have any familiarity with the Australian Communist Party or the Communist Party of Australia, Marxist-Leninist? Any views on either? Well, there is a Khrushchevite revisionist party in Australia. I believe that's the Australian Communist Party. That's like the descendant of the original Australian Communist Party. So I think that's the CPA. There's the Communist Party of Australia. There's the Australian Communist Party. I think two of those are revisionist organization. One of those is a revisionist organization. There is a slightly better version, I think, which is simply called the Australian Communist Party, which is a much more better developed Marxist-Leninist organization, as far as I can tell. But I will post the link to that party in the chat. Check that out if you haven't already. Errol says, Cliff walk from Bray to Greystones, great view over a little stretch of railway designed by Isambard Kingdom Brunel. Thank you very much. I'll make a note of it. Chumwa says, I need to incorporate terms degenerate and degenerated into daily interaction. You should. More people should use it, and it shouldn't be the preserve of reactionaries who are precisely the degenerated individuals we're referring to here. Daryl Davis says, do you remember Zika? Yes, I do, the Zika virus. These mutant mosquitoes went wild in Brazil. If it went for Cuba, Brazil would have been fucked over by Zika, then Ebola virus, and now dengue fever. Yes. I wonder where machinations begin and poor sanitation, lack of investment in preventative health ends. So what is it the case that Zika virus and dengue fever in Brazil are the results of a poorly funded health service and lack of preventative medicine, lack of early intervention, the complacency of and the active hostility to those things of the Bolsonaro government, or is some of it, as people seem to be suggesting, deliberate creation? I don't know the answer on that. I can take a good guess, given my knowledge, that I have some knowledge of the lack of capacity in the Brazilian health sector, but it's something I need to find out more about. Errol says, yes, I was thinking that very thing. They must be terrified of the burgeoning mob. I wonder how they feel milling about Oxford Street, wondering if they're being watched and about to be accosted. Didn't Marx say that capitalism is a revolutionary force? It is indeed a revolutionary force. The bourgeoisie are a revolutionary force, but it's a revolution that expends its progressive element very, very quickly. So, like, the progressive element is, of course, the formation of the proletariat. And as soon as the proletariat is formed, the bourgeoisie starts to regret it, because the bourgeoisie immediately sees that they've created their own gravediggers, which is why the British bourgeoisie expends its truly revolutionary potential by about 1704, in political terms. In industrial terms, its revolutionary potential lasts until about the 1850s, with the political system attached to it that they founded almost 2 centuries before. So the progressive role of British capitalism is really expended by the 1850s. At that point, you get the move to British imperialism, which is the sign of degenerating capitalism. That's my rather shorthand way of explaining it. So it is a revolutionary force, but that revolutionary force expends itself very quickly, and it becomes a fetter on the development of economy and society afterwards. Errol says that in London it's underclass rather than working class. I don't use the term underclass because I think it's imprecise. If these people live by selling their labor to an employer, then they're working class. If they're lumpens, if they either don't work at all or have fallen out of the system entirely, as I use the definitions first outlined by Marx in the Communist Manifesto, where he's talking about the definitions of bourgeois and proletarians, and then proletarians, petty bourgeoisie, and proletarians and the lumpen. So I don't use the term underclass because I find it to be imprecise, for the same reason that I don't use and don't approve of the use of the term PMC. I think that's a useless theory as well. My opinion, GCCX Pro says, your opinion of the Greek professor Patelis, Dimitris Patelis. I'm not familiar with his work. So if you want me to comment on it, post something or email me something to the usual address, and I'll read it and respond when I've had time to analyze it properly. TD Mallard says, I bang on about this a lot, as I did when I was in the SP. Do you mean the Socialist Party? When I was in it, partly why I left, but we need to work towards a united front. A united front with whom? I'm assuming are you in Britain or in Ireland, if you're referring to the Socialist Party? We need, first of all, we need class unity. We need the unity of the working class in this country. Now, United Front policy, or Popular Front policy, back in the 1930s was based on the idea that to stop the march of fascism, you needed to unify the working class, and that was the working class in cases where it was only a minority of the class were communists. The bulk were still attached to social democratic or even liberal parties. So when you say we need a united front, can you specify further on what you mean? I'm going to be ending the live stream pretty soon. So for that one, feel free to email what you mean there, if you can flesh it out more, to the email address, and I will respond to it on the Q&A this weekend, if you don't mind, TD Mallard. Right. All right. Okay. GCCX Pro says he's a key member of the World Anti-Imperialist Platform. Okay. So I haven't read a lot of his stuff, clearly, because I wasn't familiar with the name. So what I will commit to do, GCCX Pro, is I will go back into the WAP archive on there, and I'll look up some of his writings and I'll go through them, because clearly it's something I need to catch up on. I'm behind in my reading of the WAP material, so I need to go back and catch up on it. Not a pacifist asks, could you say more about your rejection of the notion of PMC? Tell you what, not a pacifist, as it's we're heading into the midnight hour. I'm going to draw this one to a close now, but if you email me that question, I'll add it to the Q&A for this weekend. Thank you very much. All right, so tomorrow we have the bridge analysis of the collapse of the Baltimore Bridge and what it tells us about American capitalism. So please join me for that one. But for Patreon users, I'll be doing Patreon subscribers, I should say, I'll be doing a special bonus edition tomorrow because I'm off seeing the newly released film called Late Night with the Devil. So it's a sort of an independent, I believe, Australian funded film. So I'm going to be doing a quick half-hour review of that after I've seen it tomorrow for Patreon subscribers. So you can tune into that one as well. And you'll be able to find audio versions of all the programs that we do on Patreon. If you want to support the program, either subscribe on there or go through the Buy Me a Coffee link. Thank you to everybody who's joined me this evening for this stroll through the sordid highways and byways of British imperialist history. I have listed the sources used in this episode on the Marx, Engels, Lenin, Stalin, Mao Institute Telegram discussion groups, which you can now find in multiple format on the Telegram app. And the sources I've used for this episode are listed on there. Thank you to everybody who has joined me tonight, and I'll be back with you again tomorrow.